Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Sharby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. We are here with you guys live and in the flesh. And yeah, we're coming off of a somewhat insane overtime game, a series opener for the Celtics
Yeah.
and the Pacers, which was somewhat avoidable, but nonetheless, we'll get into that in a second. But regardless, all of you guys who are in here that are new, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes. Yeah. So we just wrapped up game one of the Eastern Conference Finals between the Celtics and the Pacers. Overtime thriller, according to the Homelander, dumbest overtime of all time. It was something. It was a spectacle. Yeah, and I guess we'll start at the beginning of the game, right? The Celtics throw the first punch, they go up 12-0. And the Pacers just look absolutely just horrified, right? Nothing's going in, turnovers. But then eventually they kind of find themselves, they settle down, and it's kind of like a back and forth scoring effort over most of the first half. Then halftime, it's a tie game, 64-64, right? Then it kind of follows a script of Celtics go out front, then Pacers come back. Celtics go out front, Pacers come back right at the end of the third quarter, right? The Pacers go on a really quick scoring burst, right, to get it to a 1-point game. Halliburton banks in that three at the end of the quarter. Right. Then in the fourth, the Pacers kind of have the upper hand where they're in the lead for most of the fourth quarter, right? It's back and forth, and then you can kind of see the issues that have plagued the Celtics offensively, for a long time, right? Where it's a lot of just bad possessions on offense, where it's too much one-on-one, not enough ball movement, poor decision making from a lot of guys. And it looked like the Pacers were about to steal the first game in Boston, right? But then, according to the Homelander, game was stupid, and then something happened, and then Indiana throws the ball away, then Boston throws the ball away, then Indiana throws the ball away again. So now, baby Pacers wet the bed. Yeah. I mean, that was bad. And then, right, it's about 7 seconds or so to go in the at the end of the fourth, right? I think 15 or so. Then Jaylen Brown catches the ball in the corner, right? Siakam gets there a little late, so he's kind of hesitant to foul, right? Usually you want to foul when you're up three, so that way they don't get off a shot. But he didn't foul. You can debate whether or not there was enough time, because he didn't really, dribble or anything. But I don't know. Like, I just think, like, at a certain point, you kind of just should have had everybody at the 3-point line in the first place, so that way, worst case scenario, you give up a quick two, then you make free throws. Instead, you did the worst possible thing: not foul, give up other than a 4-point play, not foul, give up a three. It was a tough shot, so it wasn't like it was wide open three. He didn't put his hands up; he just put his hands back behind him, so that way it wasn't a 4-point play. But yeah, that was the game there, right? Once that happened, you just knew the Pacers were going to find a way to screw it up in overtime, and they did, right? Boston kind of woke up, looked a couple of times like they might give it back to the Pacers, but I don't know. Whoever would have won this game, anyways, it would have felt like a steal because Boston played poorly to me, other than the first quarter, or really the opening part of the first quarter. And then, like Keith well said, the Pacers kind of fell apart, right? Halliburton had some really bad turnovers, right? Just dribbling the ball off of his foot or whatever that was. Some poor possessions, right? But, in Boston, ended up pulling it out, right? Does it make you feel great about Boston? Maybe not, but it's also a win, and it's better to win that game than lose it. Because if the Celtics had lost that game, I mean, I guess in theory you could bounce back, but I think for the Pacers losing that game, that's tough. Not that they can't go back and score again, but that was kind of like a perfect script to steal game one, where everything's clicking on offense. Nobody's necessarily playing great defense, but, on offense, the Pacers are kind of clearing the Celtics in terms of execution and shot making. But then you couldn't close it out, and that's just rough because now you have to have a game like that again in Boston, which I think is going to be a little bit more difficult because I think, you could have caught the Celtics at a time where they're a little bit, I don't know, kind of out of it because they haven't played in a little while. I mean, because there are some times where sometimes it's an advantage to have time off, and then other times it's an advantage to just go right in, right? Like the Pacers came off a 7-game series, so they had only played a couple days ago, right? And they looked like they were ready for it, but then they gave it up. Boston won it, and that might be the series right there. Obviously, you don't want to call a series after one game, but it sucks because, if you're Indiana, because, we thought it might go 6. And if they had won this game, probably go 6. But not that it can't, because obviously Indiana, could just win at home. But I think if you're Indiana, it would have been great to steal game 1 at Boston. But now it's kind of just a blip, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. You lost the game, so now Boston goes into game 2 thinking, all right, we can play better than this, at least on the defensive end, right? Because they scored 133, even though the offense was pretty bad late in the game. But defensively, we know the Celtics can be better. Even though, like, you could kind of tell without Porzingis, there were some issues, right? Like, a guy like a Miles Turner gave some of the backup bigs for Boston some problems because he's a good athlete and he can shoot. Obviously, Al Horford, right? He's in drop trying to guard like Halliburton or Nemhart, which is tough. Not that Porzingis is going to be much better in drop, but he's, so much taller that it's not going to be as bad for him as, compared to a guy like Horford, who's a lot smaller as a 5. So it just feels like kind of a blown opportunity for Indiana to, even if not necessarily win the series, at least put more pressure on Boston. Whereas, like, now you're probably going to get a better version of Boston in game 2. And now you're probably going to go back to Indiana down 0-2 as opposed to a split, which, if you're Indiana, that would have been the best case scenario. Not that you can't still, protect home court in Indiana, but would have been a lot better to have gotten the first game at home. Game came down to who was going to sell first. Yeah, I mean, in overtime, I didn't really think either team played that well in overtime. Boston just, I guess, was just not as bad as Indiana, right? Like, Boston made some decent plays, but, like, against a better team, they probably would have lost that game for sure. But, again, this is who you're playing right now. Hopefully Indiana learns from this and doesn't do that again, but you may not have the opportunity to do that again because ideally you always want to catch, the higher seed by surprise and, game 1. Again, not impossible to pull it off in game 2, but it becomes a lot harder.
Yeah, it really sucks for Indiana from their perspective because, they kind of, I think, executed a lot better than Boston for the majority of the game, pretty much up until the fourth quarter and the overtime.
Especially with Halliburton and Siakam together and
exactly.
Turner.
It was working. Like, that big 3, I guess you can call it that, was looking very good. And that's kind of what we talked about going into this series. We were like, that it would probably be a little bit closer than people thought just because Porzingis isn't here at the moment. And, Miles Turner actually had a very, very good game offensively. It's just, it's tough because the Pacers, they shot 53% from the field in this game, 37 from the 3. So you were more efficient than the Celtics overall throughout this entire game. You just sold it in the fourth quarter, really, and obviously overtime. But how about Jason Tatum, having a bounce back game and kind of finding his rhythm? I know for a lot of the game he was wishy-washy, but at the end of the day, he came through in the clutch. Also Jaylen Brown as well. So both those guys, that's why you kind of pay them the big bucks because, they show up when you most need them for sure. Yeah. But there were a lot of funky plays, blocks from behind, fouls on the 3. I was just like, I was kind of in awe. I didn't know who was really going to win this game.
Yeah, it was like it's kind of like the Homelander said, who was going to play worse more, or first, or like you said, sell first. I mean, but, to be fair to, Brown and Tatum, like you said, they were able to close it out. But against the Pacers, that's the tough part for Indiana is you don't really have anybody that can really effectively guard either of those guys. Mm-hmm. I guess your best bet is Nesmith, but then obviously he fouled out in overtime. But, either way, it kind of felt like, and that was when the game was in balance. But either way, that's the tough part because it's just like, if you're Indiana, can you have a better performance on offense than this? Yeah, I guess, maybe. But at the same time, this was good enough to get the job done, against the Celtics team that was kind of on that was kind of on their heels for most of the game. And it's just a brutal loss, right? But again, hopefully you look at it as a learning experience if you're the Pacers. But, I mean, how much better realistically could they be? I mean, like, this was a game where, like, they didn't even really get a lot of fouls to go their way, right? Like they only had 10 free throws, and a third of those were basically like on foul jumpers or whatever, right? Because Halliburton had 3 free throws. Somebody else I think got fouled on a jumper if I'm not mistaken. But like, I don't know, like just rough. Because again, like you could have won this game. You should have won this game.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you give credit to Boston for being able to kind of close it out, but also Boston. How do you even get in this position in the first place? I mean, but. It's just kind of a weird thing, but just kind of an example of, just an inexperienced team where it's like, it's kind of funny because like you said, the reason why we thought it would be closer is, the Pacers, I think would be better than the teams that Boston played, like not just in terms of like the team itself, but also like they were healthier, right? Like the Pacers are better than the Heat without Jimmy Butler and Terry Rozier.
Mm-hmm.
They're better than Cleveland, when Cleveland didn't even have Mitchell for half the series or Jared
Mm-hmm.
Allen at all,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then also for the Pacers, this Celtics team is the best team that they've played by a significant margin, right?
Sure.
Because Bucks in the first round without Giannis at all, then a Knicks team that by the end of it was basically down to 5 players, right? So, if you're the Pacers, you could have had a lot of confidence, but now it's kind of back to the drawing board. But I guess in a way, offensively, you kind of just do a lot of what you were doing, but you kind of also have to expect Boston will probably make some adjustments. So that's kind of the tough part. Because, like you said, for most of the game, the execution was good. Because again, Siakam was getting to his spots, Halliburton was making his threes and getting to his spots, and wasn't really doing a lot of bad in terms of he was aggressive, he was passing, like he was doing everything you would have wanted. Even Nemhart, right, was kind of having some bounce back performances after a couple of rough games against New York.
Yeah.
Right, Turner, as you mentioned, was good. Siakam, or excuse me, Neesmith started off kind of slow and then picked it up. And even McConnell, right, had his moments, but then it was just like it all comes crashing down, and that's the tough part about all these playoff games is that in a close game, making those type of mistakes are so much more backbreaking than in a regular season game, right? Because in a regular season game, until it's game 82, right? Like there is a tomorrow, right? Where it's like, okay, we lost 1 out of 82, not that big of a deal. But in the playoffs, now you're down 0-1, so you can only lose 3 more games. And you just never want to. The last thing you want to do is give away a game. It's one
Mm-hmm.
thing if you lose by 20 plus
Mm-hmm.
because you just got outshined, but Indiana could have and should have won this game, but at the end of the day, they didn't. So now you go into Boston again. And, again, Boston's going to be better prepared, right? Because, even the crowd, right, at different points was, excited. And then it got really quiet because they felt like that they were getting ready to lose this game. But once it was overtime, nobody was quiet because once it was OT, you knew Indiana was going to lose. Like, you just knew it was going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Like, even when they were up, like, at least I didn't believe for 1 second they were going to, close it out and win it. Like, you just knew. Like, that was their moment, and they kind of blew it.
Yeah, 100%. And I like you talked about, I thought Indiana did a great job the majority of this game. Like they did exactly what they were supposed to up until those last 2 minutes, where they're attacking Al Horford on the switch, which is amazing, and that's where you saw Tyrese Halliburton and Nemhard really excel. And I think that's what they're going to continue to do, and that's what they should be doing because you don't have a Porzingis right now. But yeah, just an overall horrible sell job, I think. They were just plays where you kind of just end up scratching your head. From both sides, really. Like Tatum throwing the ball away, that was abysmal.
Yeah, because I think what was it? I think it was the fourth, right, where it was Derek White, right? He went for the layup, which wasn't bad. He just missed it. He blanked the layup, and then Tatum got the offensive rebound, and then just took up like this really bad contested fadeaway from about like a little past the free throw line over Miles Turner. And I think that was the fourth quarter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like that was a play that was just horrible. And then, Indiana gives it right back and it just basically is like, yeah, here you go. We may not actually want to win this game. I'm not saying that's actually what happened, but
Right.
it's just rough because, I mean, again, you look at the Indiana box score, 25 and 10 from Halliburton, 6 of 14 from 3. Nemhard 12 and 7, Miles Turner 23 and 10 with 2 blocks, Siakam with 24 and 12. 14 and 6 from Neesmith, right? All these guys basically around 50% or better. You even got 15 from Toppin off the bench, 13 from McConnell off the bench, but then somehow you don't win that game. Like it's just awful. Like I mean that's kind of the rough part. Like Jaylen Brown again, like he hit a clutch 3, so you give the Jays a lot of credit for being able to kind of pull it out. But like I don't know, Drew Holiday also had a pretty good game, right?
Good
He had 8 points, 8 assists, 7 rebounds, 4 of 8 from 3. But I don't know, just kind of an ugly, even though it was high scoring, this was kind of just an ugly game to close it out, right? Which again, it just kind of, which is weird for Boston because again, Boston's a really good defensive team, but obviously Indiana is a very good offensive team, so they can be tough to stop, which is weird because it just feels like that the way they play shouldn't necessarily carry over into the postseason, but for the most part it has, right? Like they've been shooting over 50 from the field like every game, even in some of the games that they've lost in the playoffs, right? They're shooting well from 3. But Yeah, it's just kind of rough, right? So, we'll see if they bounce back for game two. But yeah, again, not great.
Yeah, I don't think they bounce back, and we could probably probably talk about our game two predictions and stuff because I think the Tatum and Jaylen Brown factor is probably going to be too overwhelming for them. You don't have anybody that can guard them outright, point blank, period. You
And
see
then
sometimes where it's like Tatum and Jaylen Brown don't really get stopped; they really stop themselves by making things a little bit more difficult than need be. But at the end of the day, they're the two best players on the floor, and that's how it really should be for this series, I think.
Yeah, and then the Porzingis factor, right? According to Woj, right, he's could be back by game four, right? So again, that kind of underscores if you're the Pacers, would have been nice to have won game one, right? So then, worst case scenario, you go back to Indiana with a split, and maybe you win another one in Indiana,
Mm-hmm.
and get it to possibly a 6-game series. But now, if it's 2-0 going back to Indiana, and then Porzingis comes back like in game four or whatever, like that's gonna be rough. Again, we didn't expect the Pacers to win the series, and honestly, this first game was a little bit closer than I think you might have expected. But again, like at the same time, like we knew the reason why we thought it might go six is because the Pacers, even though they also liked Boston, had an advantage of playing some shorthanded teams. You just knew the offense, at least for a game or two, should be able to kind of overwhelm Boston because it's tough at times. Like if every, because again they can get good shots, right? It's not necessarily that they have a bunch of guys that are super skilled offensive players.
Mm-hmm.
They have I mean, like they can create really good looks down the floor with because you have a guy like Halliburton that puts guys in the right spots, who also can make shots on his own, right? Even a guy like Nemhard, who's just like another tertiary guy that you can just kind of give the ball to in certain spots. And then obviously Turner with the way he's played in the postseason. So brutal loss for Indiana, but you just kind of, I guess, move on to game two and just kind of see if you can do it again.
Yeah, and yeah. So you think that they're going to lose game two as well, the Pacers?
It feels like after, because like here's the thing, like if even if they had won game one, I probably still would have said that they would have lost game two. But I feel like now that they lost game one, like they're definitely going to lose game two, where it's
Right.
just like, just feel like you're going to get a more composed, just more locked in version of Boston. All right, Zay Williams, welcome in. Halliburton lost me money, bro. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, again, just some brutal decisions down the stretch, including just like a couple of just what was that type of moments, right? Where it was just like I said, the one where I think it was Holiday, he just lost the ball, bringing the ball up the floor against, it's ball pressure, but how often do you usually see like somebody just lose the ball like that?
Is that when he
Like
fell into Breen and JJ Redick and them?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like how often does that happen?
Yeah.
Like sometimes you might pick up the ball and you might be forced to kind of give it up and throw it away or something, but not like just get bumped and fall out of bounds. But yeah, that's the rough part. Is just, but I mean, this is sometimes what happens, with with these young teams. Sometimes where they're gonna make mistakes, but it just is brutal how they looked composed for almost the entire game, other than early in the first, but then right at the end, again the two brutal turnovers. And I also like, I think they had a timeout or two left. I would have probably just considered using one just to avoid like a disaster because it's just like a guy running towards the out of bounds area when you throw the pass in, it's kind of dangerous, right? It'd be one thing if he was running the opposite direction, where like where it takes a lot longer for the ball to go out of bounds, but doing it right there is just, I don't know what they were thinking. Like, I mean, do you credit the Boston defense or is it mainly just a horrible mistake? I mean, I don't know. That's bad, but it feels like they're probably gonna never bet Halliburton. I mean, he's had some good games in the playoffs. I know he's had like some inconsistent games at times, but it's just brutal because it always feels like like the one time that like you might bet like on somebody who is kind of a rising ascending guy, they end up having a stinky offensive performance, like say like Edwards in Game 7, who did other good things, but like if that was the one game you chose to bet on Edwards and then he has like a horrible offensive shooting performance, like that's tough. But yeah, I mean, I feel like the Pacers might get blown out in game two. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, like I don't usually like doing like game to game predictions or scenarios when Porzingis return. Y'all bet, I don't bet.
No, we don't. We
I
don't
per-
sports
yeah,
bet.
Yeah, I personally don't bet. I know people who do.
100%.
I'm just like too worried of like just like a scenario like that where it's just like you think that you have everything planned out, it's gonna go your way, and then something dumb like that happens where it's just like you're one stat line away, and then somebody like airballs a wide open shot or like just something stupid happens. I'm just like too concerned about doing that.
Yeah, and I think to the comment about when Porzingis returns, it'll be game over. Yeah, for sure. And I think with Indiana, you were supposed to really. The only way that you were going to win this series was if you took games 1 and 2, and probably 3 as well. Because as soon as Porzingis comes back, it's going to be over. Like we all
I
know
mean,
that Porzingis is going to outplay Miles Turner and kind of put him in his place. Like no weird things, but like they're in different tiers. I think.
I guess my only question for Porzingis is what does he look like physically
Okay.
when he comes back? Because again, we haven't seen him in a while. And he had a similar injury that Giannis had. I mean, I guess if he's coming back, right, he'd be okay enough to play. Maybe he doesn't, he might be on a minutes restriction, but
Mm-hmm.
either way, like, you never know. Because, like, if they win the first 2 games, or let's say they win game 3 and they're up 3-0, they may not bring him back. They might just be like, let's not rush it. Let's just kind of sit him again and then just, like, wait until the finals or something. So, there's no pressure to bring him back. Like,
Yeah.
if it was like, a split going to Indiana, or like you said, if the Celtics were, somehow down 2-0, going back to Indiana, maybe you rush it back, in like games 3 or 4, right? Because, those games would be must wins. But, now you don't really have to do anything. It's like, if ball, you should bet. I mean, I just don't.
Yeah, everybody's different, bro. But yeah. Um. So I guess we should talk about the next matchup, which is going to be tomorrow. And that's going to be Dallas versus Minnesota, game 1. And what are your thoughts on this one? Because I think Minnesota's probably going to take this one. And
Yeah,
that might be a
yeah.
hot take though, but I don't know.
Well, Minnesota's at home.
Yeah.
Obviously, just got done with a game 7. I mean, a pretty, physical 7-game series. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I guess Dallas' series wasn't as taxing, but you never know because it could go one of 2 ways, right? Either Minnesota comes into the series, it was a 7-game series, and like Indiana, they're pretty, locked in and composed, and it carries over into game 1, or they're kind of gassed, and then Dallas just runs over them, in game 1. I'm gonna go with Minnesota in game 1 just because again the home factor, and I think they'll be ready to roll. But it's going to be an interesting series because Dallas is a very different team from Denver, right? They don't have the same type of interior guy like a Jokic, right? They got, Gafford at the 5, who's a very different player, Lively as a backup center, but they have way more perimeter offense, right? Because obviously, like, we know Denver has guys that can score, like, Jamal Murray or obviously Jokic or, Michael Porter Jr. can get hot. But remember, they're a team that doesn't take a lot of threes. And they don't make a ton of them, right? Like, they just, that's not what they do, right? They kind of work, inside out, sort of, for the most part. But Dallas can kind of score from, they can get hot from the 3, right? They have a guy like a Kyrie, Luka. They both take a lot of threes. Obviously, PJ Washington now is all of a sudden turned into, one of the greatest corner 3-point shooters ever. But that's also going to be another factor that I think is interesting is because guys like those guys, Derek Jones Jr. and PJ Washington, shot really well against OKC. Do they do it against Minnesota where Minnesota's got more size, got more length, especially on the closeouts, right? Because let's say Minnesota leaves a guy wide open. They can close out better than OKC because they have more length. But, at the same time, Dallas has some real shot makers, that especially from the guard spot that Denver doesn't have other than Murray, right? Like they have 2 elite shot makers. So that makes a lot of a difference compared to, what you were doing with Denver. But also Dallas defensively, to be fair, has been, I think, the number 1 defense, right, since the trade deadline. So obviously that's a smaller sample size than Minnesota, who was the number 1 defense over the entire season. But at the same time, there's a lot of positives to like about what Dallas can do on the defensive end because now they have more size, now they have more athleticism to put alongside Luka and Kyrie. So, they have, even though again they don't have 2 7-footers, obviously, right? But their rim protection is, I think, better than Denver's, right? Because like, not that Jokic can't defend, but just a guy like a Gafford or a Lively can just probably protect the rim a lot better than, say, like a Jokic. Kai going for 50. I'm kind of curious to see what he does in this series. Ant-Man wants to guard Kyrie because I think that's what the matchup is going to be, because I think McDaniels will be on Luka, and I think
100%.
Ant-Man will guard Kyrie Irving, right? Because he guarded Jamal Murray, right, for a good chunk of that Denver series, right? Especially what was in the second half of Game 7. He was the one on Murray, right? Now, Kyrie's a different player. He's not as big or as physical as Jamal Murray, but he's also, I think, a better player, right? And, he's also got a lot more speed to his game. So that's a lot different than a guy like Jamal, where it's like him and Ant-Man are similar sizes, but Ant-Man's a lot more athletic. But Kyrie has the quickness where he might be able to kind of get some angles where he can kind of get around him, right? A little bit more of a
skilled player that Ant-Man has had to guard in the playoffs.
Right. And then also you have to factor he's playing next to Luka on the perimeter.
Right.
Right. So then that means that you're going to have a lot of energy taxed off, trying to guard those two guys. But I am curious to see what Kyrie does, right? Because in the OKC series, right, it was a little bit different than what we saw against the Clippers. Because pretty much against the Clippers, like every game, he was putting up big numbers, mostly in the second half. But still, whereas in the OKC series, he had some games where he was a little bit more quiet. But I guess also like OKC's defense was, better than what the Clippers could do without Kawhi. So I'm kind of curious to see what Minnesota does, because I think there's going to be probably at least a couple of games where Dallas just gets hot from three in a way that Denver just doesn't. And then that might not be enough for Minnesota to, make up for, on the offensive end. Right. But I think at least for game one, I'm going to go with Minnesota. But, at the same time, I think it's not going to be like this game, right? Like, it's not going to be a 130 to 120 whatever affair. It's probably going to be a little bit lower scoring, just because, you're dealing with, two teams that aren't quite as good on offense as Indiana and Boston, right? Because Boston and Indiana, those were basically two top 5 offenses the entire year, right? Whereas Minnesota's like 16th in offense, and then Dallas, I think, was around 10th on offense, right? But obviously, it's changed a lot since the deadline, so.
Yeah, and another thing, like with this series, I think, as good as Chet is on both ends of the floor, he's not a Rudy Gobert. Rudy Gobert is more, obviously stronger, bigger, and definitely a 4-time depoy. So, you're going to have to deal with him as well, alongside Towns, who's shown some willingness to defend. And even, what's his name? Naz Reid, coming off the bench, who plays bigger than he looks.
And that's the other factor that I'm curious about, say, with the Minnesota Bigs, where now they're going to be in some interesting spots where, okay, they're going to be switched probably at times because, Dallas does a lot of pick and roll. You're going to see some possessions where, like, Kyrie, and that's where Zay Williams talks about, Kyrie going for 50, and he says Mavs in 6. And that's a big part of what he's kind of probably talking about, where it's like Wolves bigs will rain and turn around jumpers on Dallas. Really, to me, I'm kind of curious to see the matchups, because, say, like a Luka and Kyrie in the pick and roll, they're going to get guys like Towns and Gobert switched onto them on the perimeter, and they did a decent job against, the Suns' offensive guys. I think, for the most part, obviously they would pick up fouls here and there, but, they did as decent of a job as they could. But this is this is a little bit different of a mix, right? Like, this is a group in Dallas that's a lot more organized, a lot more professional than what we saw from the Suns. So, I think this is a series where I think this is kind of like Nuggets Wolves, where it's a coin flip, right? Like, you could tell me that either team would win this series, and it wouldn't really be that surprising. I think for the Mavs, what's going to be a little bit more difficult is because, again, you beat OKC on the road, so you give them a lot of credit, but Minnesota, I think, is a little bit different than OKC, because they have more size to kind of, challenge what Dallas can do with their bigs. And, there's going to probably be some games where, like, okay, who's the guy that guards Towns, right, in the starting 5 for Dallas, right? Because, Gafford presumably is going to roam around in the middle, right? I guess he could just be on Gobert. But then, who's the guy that matches up against Towns? Is it P.J. Washington? Is it, like, Luka? Is it Derek Jones Jr.? I'm not sure, right? Because you're probably not going to ask Luka to guard, Edwards, right? You're probably going to stick him on, either McDaniels or, maybe not even Conley, right? Like, he might be switched on the Cat at certain points. And I think that's another factor which is interesting, because, like, with Towns, right, he was posting up on, say like a Jamal Murray, right? Who's again not he's not skinny, but obviously compared to Towns, who's 7 feet tall, right? There's a lot more size that he
Mm-hmm.
has at his disposal. But
Mm-hmm.
say against Luka, Luka's a lot bigger than Jamal Murray, right? He's about 6'8", and he's a big 6'8" too. So it may not be a scenario where Towns overwhelms, a guy like a Luka in the post. They can overwhelm a Kyrie Irving, um, but it's going to be a little bit different. And I guess again, how much trust do you have in PJ Washington and Derek Jones Jr.? And you might need another guy off the bench to probably help you out because, again, Minnesota's got Naj Reid that can kind of come out there. Maybe Nickeil Alexander-Walker gets hot. So those guys, like a Nickeil Alexander-Walker is going to have to start hitting some shots. Because, again, it's just, obviously he can defend, but if he's going to be out there, he's got to be able to do both, right? 3 and
Right.
D.
Yeah.
So McDaniels, right, had some big games, right? Game 6 and 7, he had 20-something. Wolves are a different beast.
Yeah, they're hungry.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see. Because, again, they showed a lot being able to pull off the win against the Nuggets, especially in Game 7 the way they did, where they were down 20 in the third quarter and then come back and end up winning by 8, went up by as much as I think as 10. So they showed a lot. It's just, again, I'm curious to see what it looks like against Dallas because it's such a different team
Sure.
compared to what Denver does, right? Because what Denver does on offense is, very precise, but Minnesota is built to beat a team like Denver, right? But are they built to beat a team like Dallas, right? Where there's a lot more, perimeter-oriented offense. We'll see, right? Because, if the Wolves lose, that's kind of a scenario where it's like, okay, maybe that's a tougher matchup for them. And we don't have any regular season data to go off of because they didn't play any games against Dallas after the trade deadline. So, the only games they played were earlier in the year, and, that was a different Dallas team.
Right. And, I think there's less margin for error for both of these teams, considering, who they played in the previous series. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the role players, I think, from both teams as well. Because, I think Minnesota's probably going to take the Oklahoma City approach, maybe not as like blatant, where, they're doubling Kyrie, they're doubling Luka, leaving PJ Washington and Derek Jones Jr. wide open in the corner because they might just bank on their shooting to completely slide and fall off the face of the earth like it did earlier in the season. Because we talked about it when they first acquired PJ Washington, he could not find his groove, and it was like
Yeah.
that for a while. So at the end of the day, it's going to be a chess match too.
Yeah.
That's what I'm
But,
really curious about.
right. But then you still factor in, again, if a guy gets hot, sometimes over the course of a postseason, they can stay hot, right? Like even a Karl Anthony Towns, I think before Game 7 was shooting almost 50 from three,
Yeah, it was like
and
44.
on decent volume. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be a really intriguing series, right? We both got Wolves in 7,
Mm-hmm.
but I think, in terms of Zay Williams, Mavs in 6 pick, I think, there is there's a lot of, good reasoning there where there is a world where Dallas can win a series against Minnesota. It's just again, Luka and Kyrie are probably gonna have to be, better than they were the first couple of rounds, right? Like Luka and Kyrie picked it up by the end, but they're not gonna be able to have games like they had where they were a little bit quiet for most of the game and it's like, oh, PJ Washington got us 27 points in this game.
Right.
I think they're gonna need to be a little bit better. But again, it's gonna be interesting because Minnesota on offense has been a lot better in the playoffs than you would have expected, but they can still sometimes be a little bit vulnerable on offense where it can get a little bit clunky. And I'm very curious to see what the Gobert matchup looks like because he's probably at times going to have to guard Luka or Kyrie on the perimeter. And if he's out there, right, then that's going to probably lead to some more offense around the rim for Dallas, right? Because as soon as he's out of there, it's just Towns in the paint, right? Because Towns one-on-one was able to guard Jokic in the Nuggets series, but then, Gobert can be in the paint and roam around and help. But I don't necessarily know if he's going to be able to do that in this series, just because, again, the offense that Dallas runs is so different from Denver, right? Where,
Yeah.
Denver does a lot of stuff in the post. They do dribble handoffs. But, with Dallas, it's like pick and roll, isolation. Obviously, Luka, if you double him, there's a tax for that because he's a very good passer and, he can kind of have these passing angles with his size where you can kick out to guys where you don't even realize that that he's able to kind of see those type of players.
Mm-hmm.
So, Minnesota's defense is going to continue to have to be on point, which we assume it's going to be because that's their calling card. But I'm very curious because again, a Jaden McDaniels having 20 points in Game 7, that's kind of one of the differences right there, right? Because if he was playing like how he played earlier in the series, they would have lost because, you just needed another guy, on offense. And even like a Nas Reed, right? Just popping off the bench, scoring a quick 11 points, because Dallas's bench, they have a couple of guys that can kind of help, in certain spots, right? Like, say, we saw some random Jaden Hardy minutes. I don't think he did much other than, some passing,
Mm-hmm.
lobs or whatever. But, what about like a Tim Hardaway Jr.? What if he has a couple of games where he just scores like a quick 10 points in a few possessions? Stuff like that can really swing a game.
Yeah. And one more thing, probably before we get close to closing, but can't really talk about regular season numbers between these two teams because, although they did face off, Minnesota won the regular season series 3-1, but all those games were pre-deadline. So Minnesota has not faced the team as currently constructed. So that's also another factor. They are going to have to game plan completely. You can't take the regular season into account. So they're going to be watching, the film from the previous matchups of the Mavs. So that's also another thing. And that's going to be interesting because there's no better experience than actually playing, versus watching film.
And then, like, one last kind of little wrap-up thing, right? The all defensive teams, right? Those came out. So what do we think? So first defensive team, other than Herb Jones, pretty much all bigs, right? Bam Adebayo, Anthony Davis, Rudy Gobert, of course, Defensive Player of the Year. Herb Jones and Victor Wembanyama, the first rookie to be on all defense first team ever.
Yep.
And then second defensive team, right? Mostly guards, right? Alex Caruso, Drew Holiday, Jaden McDaniels, who's not a guard, right? And then Jalen Suggs for Orlando, Derek White for Boston. So, what do you think? Did they get this right pretty much for the most part? Or are there a couple of names that you kind of have a little bit of an issue with?
Yeah, 100%. I think they got it right. They're very similar to what we put out. I know we had talked about, Jalen Suggs being on there. You had to have an Orlando Magic guy for all defensive second team at least, I could understand if somebody really wanted to put a Jonathan Isaac, maybe sub him out for Suggs or something like that. But at the end of the day, they got kind of like all the marquee defenders in the league. Jaden McDaniels, obviously, Drew Holiday, Caruso, all the impact guys. I think it was amazing that Herb Jones kind of got the nudge for all defensive first team. That's pretty cool. And then obviously Wemby making history. That was kind of expected. I think we all had him on our list. But yeah, great way to divide it up, I think, because I think the big men being, in the first category is really, really special. And it kind of shows you the saturation of defenders that we really have at that position.
Yeah. And then, the positionless aspect also is kind of something that, shakes things up a little bit, right? Because now this is where, like, you might be like, okay, these are a lot of the best defensive players, in the league. Obviously, there's some names that have been, left out, right? For one reason or another, right? Like, say, like a Draymond isn't on this list, but I think he missed too many games due to, you know what happened. But yeah, exactly. So, another guy, right? Like a Giannis, he wasn't on here either, right? But, again, that's kind of the interesting thing about this list. So we got another, let's see, Homelander said Chet robbed. So what do you think about that?
No, I don't think that's a robbery at all. I think
so,
all the big men who are up here are better than Chet Holmgren on defense and the guards as well.
So I guess I'm curious, Homelander, in terms of your thoughts. Like, so, which person would you have taken off of the list, in order to get him on there, right? Because I know a lot of times, for, when people mention that somebody got robbed, like a lot of times, they may not necessarily mention like, here's a name we should take off. But, again, that's the tough part because there are a lot of really good defensive players. And it's kind of weird how, say, like for All NBA, you have 3 teams, but you only have 2 for defense. And then I think you just have 2 for rookies as well, right? So Suggs. Okay, so you would have taken off Jalen Suggs. Okay, that's interesting. I mean,
I get it.
Yeah, I mean, like, again, like, and that's kind of the thing is, like, I feel like you could take off, somebody and put somebody else on there, and I don't think people would necessarily complain, right? Like, if Chet Holmgren was on there, right, how many people would actually complain? Because OKC was a top 5 defense, all year. So, I'm glad that
he wouldn't be the one that's pointed out.
Yeah, like, I'm glad that he gave, a person, that you could take off, and it's like, I mean, you could swap him out, and it probably wouldn't be that, big of a deal, so.
It's just kind of the other because Orlando would have to have one representative just due to the fact that their defense was such a good, it was so good for the majority of the season.
Right, because like the part that's tough is that say, there are some players on here where they were on some of the best defensive teams in the league, right? Like Gobert is on Minnesota, the number one defense. Bam, I'm pretty sure Miami was a top 10 defense. Obviously the Celtics were one of the best defensive teams, so they got two guys.
Jaden McDaniels too.
Yeah, Jaden McDaniels. But then say like Wembanyama, right? Where it's like he's a great individual defender. It's just the team defensively wasn't great. I know their defensive rating was really good when he was out there.
Mm-hmm.
Or say like an AD, right? Like he's going to be on there, right? Because he's a great individual defender. It's just the Lakers defensively were kind of up and down. But then obviously, like if you watch, right, it's like, it's like, well, one of the reasons why they're up and down is, well, look at who's next to him, in
Right.
terms of the other guys on the roster. So that's where the criteria can be tough. And then, say like a Chet, the good news for him is that, like if OKC, continues to be really good and he gets on there next year, right, that might help him because I think if he gets on one of the All NBA teams, then he can get a bonus in terms of his contract, right? So then obviously that, can allow him to get paid a little bit more money. So he's going to be on there at some point. I don't know when. But again, like I think he's a good enough defender. It's just that's the thing. It's kind of like with the All NBA where there's so many good NBA players where there's going to be somebody left off the list. There's going to be really good defenders that are going to be left off the list. So
yeah, and I'm looking at the full voting results or whatever. I don't think I see Chet here. Let me see. Okay, yeah, I do see him. So
he got 21 second place votes.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah.
He got 21 second place
So
votes.
not too horrible. He wasn't too far off, and I think that kind of is a good thing, if you're an OKC fan or if you're screaming Chet got robbed, But at the end of the day, it is subjective, but I think this was a very good list, though. You can't be mad at it, I don't think.
But then you look around and you see like Bobby Portis that has like 1 second place vote.
Right.
You see like a Brandon Pajemski that has a second place vote.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just where it gets kind of interesting. I see De'Aaron Fox, Sabonis, some interesting names there, right?
Yeah.
But that's kind of the way it goes sometimes, and that's kind of one of the downsides of the voting process is that there's always gonna, in addition to some people getting on there that are deserved, then there's gonna also be some people that probably shouldn't be in there. Some of it's because of reputation, some of it's because of them being favored or whatever. But that's kind of how it goes, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I think we've covered all the bases, have we not?
Yeah. So
Okay.
obviously just remember, we're going to do another one tomorrow as well.
Yeah, so we'll have a live stream tomorrow after the series opener between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Dallas Mavericks. We appreciate everybody coming through here, interacting in the chat, and we will see you guys on the next one tomorrow.